Ever wonder what it's really like to be the President of the United States? Well, let's hear from a few men who held down the job.
As to the presidency, the two happiest days of my life were those of my entrance upon the office and my surrender of it.
I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me.
The presidency is not a bed of roses.
The president is a glorified public relations man who spends his time flattering, kissing, and kicking people to get them to do what they're supposed to do anyway.
Being president is like being a jackass in a hailstorm. There's nothing to do but stand there and take it.
Okay, so it's a tough job, but being the boss is never easy. The boss of America is the President of the United States. But at one time, our boss was a king. Why did we ditch the guy named George with the crown for the guy named George with the powdered wig? To answer that question, we need to go back over 300 years. The America we know now is made up of 50 states. But in the mid-1700s, it was just 13 small British colonies on the east coast of North America. The residents of these colonies were British citizens, ruled by the British king who lived in Great Britain, just a hop, skip, and a 6-week ocean voyage away. Britain had been ruled by kings for centuries. Among the more notable were Richard III, who many believe had his own nephews murdered so he could take power, and Henry VIII, who had several of his wives beheaded. Not exactly the kind of behavior that gets leaders elected, but that's okay because no one elects kings. They just inherit the job. Many American colonists were loyal to the king, who in the years leading up to the Revolution was King George III. By all accounts, George was a man who preferred farming to ruling an empire. He wasn't terribly interested in the plight of a bunch of fur trappers and tea merchants 3,000 miles away. Besides a king, England had an elected parliament, where all the elected officials were wealthy aristocrats. Joe Average could run for office, but only if he was Sir Joe Average. So what went wrong? What eventually drove the colonies to declare independence? Well, the big conflict started over money and unfairness, specifically taxes. The colonists had no say in how much they had to pay. Between 1754 and 1763, the colonists fought bravely with the British Army during the very costly French and Indian War. And when the war ended, Britain tried to foot the bill by taxing the good folks in the Americas. So after paying lots of money in taxes, what did America's Uncle Sam get from England's Johnny Bull? Jack squat. That's right, even after paying their taxes, the colonists had no voice in the British government and no vote in how they should be ruled. This became known as taxation without representation and would lead to the American Revolution. But there was more at stake than just money.
There were lots of reasons why the colonists wanted independence from England. Some of them were very personal. The simplest way of understanding it is that the colonists wanted their independence just to be able to direct their own lives.
So the revolution was beginning. And like all revolutions, it started with a fancy tea party. To protest a British tea tax in 1773, a group of 50 colonists, many disguised as Native Americans, boarded an English ship in Boston Harbor and dumped its entire cargo of tea into the water. This rebellious act enraged the British Parliament and probably made the fish in the harbor very wired. Back in Britain, even people who'd been rooting for the colonists feared they'd gone too far. The British government closed Boston Harbor and launched a series of laws that restricted civil liberties so severely that they became known as the Intolerable Acts. The people of Boston began to despise the crown more than they would one day hate the New York Yankees. Something had to be done. In the fall of 1774, leaders from the 13 colonies traveled to Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. Virginian attendee Patrick Henry declared,
"The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. Give me liberty or give me death."
His fellow delegates, after much consideration, decided to give Henry liberty, as long as he piped down a bit and used his indoor voice. Unfortunately, England seemed intent on dispensing the death part. A few months later, the colonists fought the British at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, thus kicking off the Revolutionary War. The first shot fired became known as the shot heard round the world, and the folks in England did not like what they heard. The colonists needed someone to lead an army against the British. They decided on a Virginian who had been a hero of the French and Indian War, General George Washington. Washington even showed up to the Continental Congress in his old uniform, which was only possible for a middle-aged man to do in the years before the invention of jelly donuts. Washington was a strong, athletic man and was over 6 feet tall, gigantic for the time. And if he couldn't win the war, he could at least play keep-away with the Redcoats. Upon accepting the assignment, Washington humbly said,
My abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust.
Maybe he was being humble, but big as he was, even Washington wasn't big enough to beat the British. Not long after he said this, the British began knocking George Washington around left and right. As 1776 rolled around, and the Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, Washington's forces seemed a little unequal to the power and might of the Redcoats. Washington lost more battles than he won during the war. His fake teeth were knocked out by the British in Brooklyn, Brandywine, and Germantown, and they chattered away a devastating winter in Valley Forge. But all this work was just preparing him for the office Washington would one day hold.
He had in fact been president long before the office existed. He had spent 8 years not only leading a revolution, but in many ways performing the executive function, dealing with Congress, wrestling with them over non-existent money and supplies, dealing with the frustrations that any president then and now confront. So he had been apprenticed to be president by the revolution.
In 1776, the rebellion was collapsing. In a letter to Congress, Washington admitted,
Our troops will not do their duty.
To his brother, he confided,
I think the game is pretty near up.
Now you know why this guy never seemed to smile. Washington knew that if the revolution were to succeed, the people would need hope. Washington ordered that the words of Patriot Thomas Paine be read to the army.
Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet it.
This was the colonial equivalent of, we've got spirit, how about you? Soon, Washington, while ignoring the very basic rules of boating safety, led a bold expedition across the Delaware River into New Jersey and attacked the British forces in Trenton. They rounded up hundreds of prisoners and forced the British back, which was much tougher to do in the days before the invention of the New Jersey Turnpike. 5 years later, the British would surrender at Yorktown. So then the revolution was over and we picked a president, right? Nope. Washington retired from public life and the US government organized itself slowly. The First Continental Congress gave way to the Second Continental Congress, which then gave way to the Congress of the Confederation. Soon, they replaced the Articles of the Confederation with the Constitution, and Article 2 of the Constitution clearly stated that we needed ourselves a president. And who presided over the ratification and signing of this document? This guy, George Washington.
Washington's significance was both symbolic and real. He was arguably the one thing that held the country together.
George Washington must have seemed very presidential, because everyone thought he'd make a pretty good first president. The citizens of each new state got their first chance to speak out. They voted for people to represent them as electors. Then the electors got together in what would later be called the Electoral College, and every one of them voted for the most well-known and beloved American in the brand new country, our first national celebrity, and probably the main reason we have a constitution in the first place, George Washington. Today, the president is still chosen by the citizens, but agreeing on a president was never that easy again.
The only reason the Constitution was passed was because it was universally believed that George Washington would reluctantly agree to be the first president. No one knew what a president was. There weren't presidents in the world.
So Washington was going to be the boss, but his power was not going to be absolute or kingish. We had just finished fighting a war against that. So the Constitution provided enough safeguards, or checks and balances, to keep the president's power from being absolute. For example,
America doesn't like its president to be a chief executive officer. The last chief executive officer we had in America was King George III of England, and we went to the Revolutionary War to overthrow that. We believe in checks and balances. so that there's not a supreme power.
The president would be the commander of the Army and Navy. But without Congress, the president can't declare war.
Founding fathers put that in the Constitution because they didn't want just one person to say, okay, I don't like Canada, we're gonna go take them over and invade.
The president can conduct diplomacy and make agreements with other nations, but any and all of his treaties have to be ratified by Congress. And no matter how powerful this new president would become, every 4 years, the American people would have an opportunity to throw him out. The president would also be able to pick his own cabinet. But before they started work, they'd need the okay from Congress. And if the president misbehaved, Congress could also vote to boot him out. But Congress couldn't just pick Washington to be president. That would have been too kingish. That's why the Electoral College was formed to vote. And to this day, Washington was the only president they ever elected unanimously. Still, some people weren't happy. Remember Patrick Henry? He was doubtful and was heard to say,
Your president may easily become a king.
wrong. And lucky for us, too.
The story of America, the story of American presidents, is how do you define men in terms of all men are created equal? We, early on, were far too limited in our definition. It meant white men. It meant rich white men to some extent.
Government comes from the people and from the consent of the people to be governed. Political participation is incredibly important. And it's important because there has been struggle over the past 200 years to make the American process a much more inclusive one.
If there's one thing that is the hallmark of our democracy, it's the continued peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next, based on their achievement, ability, and on the free choice of the American people. While some seem born for the job, none are born into it. We've had over 40 different presidents, and not one has turned into a king yet. Although if there were a king among the men who have served, it was most certainly George Washington, first president of the United States of America.